The first day of the Titans expansion was probably one of my favorite expansion releases that has ever happened in Hearthstone. Not just because the cards are extremely fun, but because a lot of people were messing around with a lot of different archetypes, and I think I found out the best decks for you to play in order to climb to Legend as quickly as possible. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first deck that we're going to be looking at is the deck that I used on my final push to Legend, and honestly, I wanted this deck to be the best deck in the game. But when I first started playing it, it really didn't work very well because I was playing a list that cut saps and cut a few other cards that maybe should be included in this list. And like case in point, I remember when my chat was telling me that Inzo was not 100% necessary in a deck like this, but let me tell you, because of Turn the Tides being an overload card as well as, Lightning Bolts costing free in some situations, you really want to be able to play Inza because the setup of this combo is to play Inza as well as double Flash of Light in order to make your nature cards cost 1 mana less. Or essentially 2 mana less, and in some cases 3 mana less, depending on whether or not you have the Inza or not. And the whole point of this combo is to OTK in 2 different ways. You have Horn of the Windlord to work with Turn the Tides, which I have done, 24 damage with this weapon because of randomly discovering cards. You have, the spell damage combo that's possible by playing Champion of Storms into a bunch of nature spells, then playing Bioluminescence in order to give you an insane amount of spell damage to where you can play Lightning Bolts as well as the new card Crash of Thunder, which is effectively a 0 mana deal however much damage your spell damage is giving you. And then the real meat and potatoes of this deck is the Lightning Reflex is giving you extra tools in order to combo with this deck. So in case you don't have everything set up or you need to go for like a Hail Mary turn, you can easily try to find some of the nature cards out of Lightning Reflex, which if you take a look at the nature cards in Shaman, you have Zap, Lightning Bolt. You can't discover Lightning Reflexes, but you also can find another Flash of Light, which if you already played both of them, will just draw you another card. You can find another Bioluminescence if you need to go there. Feral Spirit to give you board. Lightning Storm just to play a nature card. Primordial Wave is probably the worst card to get out of this, and the only reason why this isn't in the deck is because we're not seeing more mech decks. You've got Hex, you've got Turn the Tides, which is an amazing card to find. You have Altered Chord, which could be, valuable in some instances. Command of the Nepthalon, probably the most underwhelming if you're doing the combo, as well as actually Crash of Thunder in order to deal damage to your opponent and kill them. And I gotta say, this feels like the best deck that I have messed with so far because the potential of this deck is really good to the point where you are actually not an OTK deck. You are playing for tempo more times than not, so that way you can actually, deal that chip damage to where you don't have to do this massive 30 damage combo. No. You just need to usually deal 12 or 15 all to the face because you've dealt most of the damage throughout the course of the game with cards like Feral Spirit chipping in damage and the Titan. I am super close to just crafting this card golden. The only reason why I haven't done that yet is not because I don't want to, but because I need the other cards still. I'm still missing a lot. But oh my god, this feels like the best Titan to take advantage of, and it's not just because of Roaring Oceans being like a combination of like Brukan's AoE and healing effect. No. It's because of, well, first of all, his, making each spell cost 3 less, so it's really easy to get rid of cards, but the draw 3 overload cards is extremely important in this deck, so that way you can build up the OTK with this deck a little bit more effectively. So I will say that this deck is my #1 choice if you want to have the most interesting climb on your way to Legend, because this deck has a lot of choices that are very important. There are times where it's like, I ended up almost losing a game the other day, or when I was playing last night, because I ended up overloading when I should have waited for like a Lightning Storm turn, and luckily I did actually end up winning this game because my opponent really wasn't familiar with my outs, and I was playing the game very well. But you have to watch out when you overload yourself, because you only have 1 copy of Overdraft, and Thorum the Stormlord is a good, way of unlocking your overloaded mana crystals, but there are some situations to where you still don't have enough mana anyway, so you really got to be paying attention to your decisions. This isn't really an autopilot deck, but this is the deck that I ended up hitting Legend with yesterday, and I ended up having a 6-2 record, and last night I continued playing to an 8-4 record, so this deck is just getting better. It's still staying at a 75%, and this is probably going to be the deck that I'm playing the most over at twitch.tv/ClarkHELLSCREAM today. So after this video is posted, as well as the Nature Shaman video that I have planned, I'm going to be streaming a lot, so if you guys want to get some good games in, feel free to come by the stream. But regardless, I cannot recommend this deck more than I am right now, which is why I'm putting it at the beginning of the video. But yeah, Nature Shaman is absolutely the nuts right now. Next up is the deck that I had the most amount of wins with on stream yesterday, and to no surprise, it's Treant Druid. I knew this deck would be good, but I thought there would be more decks that would aim to, like, you know, have more AoEs and get rid of our Treant board because, you know, playing Disciple of Erenar into the Drum Circle is probably one of the most busted things that Druid can do for, like, overall tempo, to where if you even have a minion on the field, this is just going to get out of control. And then you also have cards like Cultivation, which, when you pair with Solar Eclipse, works extremely well at just, you know, either doing two things. Setting up an OTK of Burst, or just building up a gigantic board to where, you know, it's turn 5 or turn 6, opponent. How are you going to deal with, you know, all of these stats on the field unless you're playing exactly Control Priest and you play exactly Shadow Word Ruin? So this deck has a lot of ways of just being able to scam games. Like, one thing in particular, which will be coming up in a video in the future, I ended up playing Planted Evidence. I found Sunwell when I already had a Lifebinder's Gift in my hand, and I had enough mana to play the Sunwell and then discount my entire hand by 1. Lifebinder's Gift is just an insanely good card, and I'm really worried about the wild format because I'm assuming this card is absolutely wreaking havoc in decks like Fatigue Druid with with Tony and Naturalizes and whatnot. But regardless, this is not wild. I mean, it's a wild deck, don't get me wrong. This deck is kind of insane, because Topior, I didn't even get to play this card yet, because I never drew it off of the Summer Flower Child. But this deck has a lot of gas, I mean, it may not look like a deck that has a lot of gas, because it's like, you know, if you set up the board and then it dies, then what? It's a very good question. You just build up another board, because you have, you know, Summer Flower Child in order to draw your Drum Circle, your Topior, and your Cultivation. And honestly, I am not really a big fan of Ancient of Growth. I understand the thought process with this card where it's like, it's just another way of being able to set up a board, but in all honesty, I would rather just commit my Drum Circle board and then save the second Drum Circle for like a potential like game-winning situation to where I throw it out when I have lethal. But every single time I had this card in my hand, I was just not a fan of it. So I ended up deciding to like make a build that's a little bit more, I guess, aggressive instead of just trying to build up as many Treants as possible, because it's all about making a big board that your opponent cannot kill as soon as possible, kind of similar to old Drum Druid. But regardless, this deck is probably the most consistent, probably the safest craft, I want to say, because just summoning a board only has one weakness. Either summoning a bigger board or clearing it, and I'm telling you right now, there's no deck that's going to make a bigger board as fast as Treant Drum Druid will. So if you want the safest craft of the expansion right now, I would say that this is probably the way to go. And speaking of safe crafts, oh my god, Relic Demon Hunter feels absolutely disgusting to the point where I don't even think I was playing this deck very well, and some of these card tech decisions may not be 100% the way to go in the future, because like cards like Mythical Terror, some people just weren't sold on this card being good in Relic Demon Hunter, but I actually had a few games yesterday where if you don't have like the Arcanist, Enchanter, Unleash Fell combo, then you can just play a Mythical Terror against a bunch of 1/1s and you effectively, you know, Reno yourself back up to full life. I think that this card has a lot of potential, but I wouldn't be surprised to see this card get cut in the future. However, one card that is definitely not going to get cut is Jotun the Eternal. This card is just absolutely nuts for every single reason that you think it is. Being able to summon extra relics automatically, boom, and then you get the card in your hand still. Relics are going to be absolutely disgusting to the point where I feel like it might need to be nerfed. I don't know how else to nerf it except, you know, making Relic Vault go back to its original cost of 3, but honestly, that's going to really slow down the deck in some regards, so maybe that'll just end up killing the deck. But there is just so much value here, dude. Forget, you know, finding cards off of Nerubian Vizier. I literally cut School Teacher because we don't really care about finding the extra relics off of Nagalings. You are just going to find extra copies of them with Runic Adornment. This is just an insanely good card, and if you think about it, it's like School Teacher, but different. Like, you discover the card, hopefully that you want, and then you have 2 extra copies that automatically cast when you draw them, as well as having the discovered spell actually in your hand. So I think this might be the replacement for School Teacher, but maybe in the future, you know, some of these new cards get fizzled out. Get it? Haha, gotcha. But regardless, Jotun is just absolutely busted, and honestly, I've been hearing some people say that the Argus, the Emerald Star, is not a good Titan. I have no idea what these people are on, because this card has so many different ways of being utilized, where you do have, you know, the taunts that you can summon out, that give you an entirely, you know, it gives you a way of being able to fight back. Obviously, they have Rush and Lifesteal, so it's a good way of being able to fight for board, as well as, like, you know, summoning taunts that get in the way of the Argus himself, so he hopefully can survive. And one thing that I've done a few times is actually play the reduce the cost of all minions in my hand, especially after I've already, you know, drawn from the Relic of Extinctions, to where, you know, suddenly 2 mana discounts become 4 mana discounts, And that can really add up when you're talking about cards like Mythical Terror. Like, it just really makes a lot of sense why this card kind of goes into the deck. But other than that, it's just the same old Relic Demon Hunter game plan. Make gigantic green idiots until suddenly your opponent can't deal with it. But now I feel like you have a little bit more sustain, as well as a lot of value that your opponent really just cannot deal with. Next up, we have Thaddius Warlock, which is probably the most popular deck that I saw yesterday, at least at the very beginning of the expansion. I believe that this deck is starting to fade out a little bit as people try to figure out the best version of this deck, because there are a lot of aggro decks that can kind of give this deck a run for its money. But there is something else that people have been referring to this deck as. Just Barnes Warlock. Because you play the 5-drop, you get the big scam, and if the big scam happens, it's really hard for your opponent to come back. But another thing that I feel like a lot of people are already familiar with, but one thing that's really powerful with this deck is being able to play Forge of Wills as soon as you can, and then you have Loken, Jailer of Yogg-Saron to discover a minion from your deck, summon a Tentacle with its stats, and of course you're just going to pull Thaddius every single time. So then by turn 5, turn 6, you have literally... let's see, 2 11/11s and a 3/3, so 25/25 in stats. There are not a lot of decks that can deal with a scam like that, which is why people have been referring to it as Barnes Warlock. But in the ETC, you have Coroner for just, you know, a good, like, freeze card in order to keep your opponent at bay. Not too sure about this in all honesty. You have Gigafin in case you need even more removal, which is just a good way of maybe getting rid of some Titans. And then you have Jailer for the obvious reasons of why you want to run Jailer and Warlock. And something else that you could do if you know you're not going up against AoEs, is that you can save both of your Forge of Wills with Jailer, so that way when you play Jailer, you're instantly threatening a board of 3 10/10s, which will hopefully deal lethal damage, so your opponent essentially has 1 turn in order to answer, and if they don't, they're just dead. So the Anubis combo is definitely good, but it's no replacing like how good the Amorphous Slime and the Loken cards really are. And this card really is just a 4-mana 7/7 taunt that really can't interact unless you have the Forge of Wills. So I can kind of understand that if this card will end up just getting cut entirely, but, you know, leaving it as 1 so that way you have, you know, your infantry reanimators and all the other important cards just makes a lot of sense in this deck. So I think that if you want to play Control Warlock, this isn't really Control Warlock, it's more Scam Warlock, but if you want to play a deck that plays Sagiras and actually wins games, this would be my recommendation. I gotta be honest with you guys. I had someone in my last stream count how many times I said the word hate. And I would tend to argue that it was because I fought a lot of this deck yesterday, and man, do I hate secrets. Secrets are really powerful right now because of the card called Bait and Switch, to where almost every single secret that comes out, I am scared of triggering this card because you don't want to be caught in a situation to where you attack into a 4/1 and then suddenly that 4/1 becomes a 7/4 and then you can't kill that 7/4 and then it's just going to start hitting you in the face until you die by like turn 3, turn 4. It's so not fair. The Hunter, I really feel like, is extremely powerful, and I'll just go ahead and spoil it. Hound Hunter is not on this list, but Hound Hunter is still a fine deck to play. You could literally just slap in the new 1-drop card that, you know, it's always a bigger Jormungandr, however you pronounce it. I don't care if I'm mispronouncing this. I don't understand what these things really are. Regardless, this card is absolutely nuts, but it's not in this deck. It's in the next deck that I will be showing you for a very specific reason. Although, I don't know why it's not in this deck. Apparently, you really just don't need it in some instances, and you can still focus on just playing Secrets, playing, Ancient Krakenbane, as well as the Starstrung Bow. Oh my god, I forgot that this card existed when I went up against the Secret Hunter, and I could have won the game if I would have gone, you know, full face and fought for tempo. But I tried to play Control, and then I got bursted for 12, and then I got, you know, bursted for another 5, for 17, all in a bunch of, like, 2 turns. It's insane how quickly Hunters are ending the game now, and Face Hunter's been kind of, like, lacking in resources for quite some time, at least in the past expansion. It was all about Hound Hunter. There was no other Hunter deck that was really doing that well, in my experience. But yeah, Secret Hunter is absolutely disgusting. I'm not too sure how good Agramar is as a card. I rated this card extremely low when he first came out, but apparently he's been doing his job. He's been doing what he needs to get a lot of damage to the face, to where I might try playing this deck, but like I said, I am really not a fan of Secrets, at least playing up against them. It's got to be a lot more fun being behind the wheel of this deck, but if you want an extremely easy Legend grind, this is probably one of the easiest ways that you can just go Unga Bunga face, not focus on the board, and just deal a bunch of damage, because man, can this deck hit hard. But if you want to make use of there's always a bigger Jormungandr, then there's definitely a way of utilizing it with Stonebound Gargant. I am not too sure about how powerful this deck is, especially when you could just literally run Hound and not worry about infusing this card. But literally, Zombies by itself automatically infuses the card for you if you have it in hand. And I'm kind of confused why there's not more Zombies and not another Titan Forged Traps in order to give us as many secrets as possible. But we've also put a Rancher in this deck, so I'm not really sure if this is the best build entirely, just because I haven't played Hunter. I'm not doubting the person who made this deck or doubting the power level of this deck. I just personally have not played it and had experience with it yet. I've just been on the other side, and sometimes I feel like I'm not playing well, and I'm like, is there a way to actually punish this deck? There might be. But if you're looking for a different version of the previous deck of Secret Hunter that's less secrets and more focusing on actually dealing damage in any games versus hoping that your opponent's just going to trigger the secrets in the wrong possible order, then this might be a better way of doing it. But I still think that Hound Hunter, with minimal changes, is probably going to be one of the best decks in the game. The only reason why I don't have a list for you is because I didn't really see it yesterday. And this is, you know, the best decks of day one. There's not a lot of people that are really playing Hound Hunter right now because they want something new, and I want to highlight some of the newer stuff right now. But if you really just want to play Hound Hunter, just put in Bait and Switch, put in, there's always a bigger Jormungandr, and then just take it from there, and you probably will be winning a lot of games. Because something else that you can do, and I know I'm talking more about Hound Hunter than I am talking about this deck right now, but if you play Faithful Companions, after you play Lorthamar and you pull out a King Mukla as a 20/20, and then you add this 1-mana card on top of it, that's a lot of damage. So there's a lot of potential for Hunter right now, and I really feel like Hunter is probably actually the best class in the game right now when you think about all of the viable archetypes that it has. So if you're a Hunter main, you're really loving this expansion right now. Next up, we have a deck that I feel like everyone kind of expected to be good, and as it turns out, yep, it's still pretty good. Sif Ganon OTK Mage has a lot of potential to where you may not even rely on the OTK every single time, because this deck has a lot of ways as playing as a control deck, actually, with cards like Inquisitive Creation, which really turned the game on its head, and cards like Star Power, so you're always constantly removing things on the field if you're not like creating more cards and trying to find more value. And I think that this is probably the best way of playing this deck. I really like the idea of running a Lady in His Jar in this deck in order to, you know, discount as many spells as possible and to set up for like a Ganon 20 damage combo. But to play a setup card just to do a 10 mana combo that only deals 20 damage, it's got to get out of the deck as much as it saddens me to say, because being able to discount your hand really does sound good, but this isn't like, you know, this isn't like a deck that only has spells. There are some minions in here, so this card just has ways of failing, plus you have to set it up with an arcane card, yada yada yada. Just don't play that card. But what you can do is that you can just play a lot of the spell school cards in order to give you an insanely good Sif, to where cards like Flame Geyser, Arcane Bolts, as well as Molten Runes are going to deal OTK God tier levels of damage. But half the time, you don't even need to deal the 30 damage. It's just good to have that against the Control Priest that will be coming. They're going to be coming soon, and I'm going to be very upset when they're all over the ladder. But my Shaman is going to be able to get us there. But regardless, this deck is just overall really good. You have a lot of value from your Cold Case and Cosmic Keyboard, which really gives you a lot of tempo in the early game. You have Volume Up in order to give you lots of value. Wisdom is just literally a draw 2 for almost 0 mana if you're playing the deck well. I'm kind of confused why there isn't a Watcher of the Sun in this deck. Like, Watcher just feels like a really good card because it gives you an automatic holy spell, plus healing in this deck is very important. But I guess in order to make room for more of the important cards, it kind of makes sense to cut this, so that way you have like more sustainability and like revivability with like Cold Case. And Elemental Inspiration is literally a card that my chat asked me if this is even worth running, and I just don't understand why people are asking this question, because this just gives you a way of being able to threaten a board that your opponent either A, has to kill, or B, it could also give you like rush minions so you can interact with the board, as well as giving you like taunts and stuff like that. And it just kind of makes sense as a 7-mana card after you've played the entire game just casting a bunch of random spell schools. So make sure that you're counting how many spell schools that you have. If you don't have Sif in hand, it will not be keeping that information in track for you. You can also keep track with your Wisdoms of Norganon. Obviously, if it costs, you know, 1 mana, you've played 4 spell schools, so that's an easy way of being able to remember it. But this deck has a lot of gas to it, to where I would not be surprised if this is one of the best decks that pops out of the Titans expansion. But if you want a deck that goes in a slightly different direction but has more of an aggressive feel to it, then Elemental Burn Mage is actually the first deck that I've ever seen that makes use of the Synthesize card in an actual legitimate way, outside of, you know, just playing Vast Wisdom and changing a 3-mana card into a 1-mana card. So this card kind of feels good as like a way of making use of your Aquatic Archivist, to where you can pressure a lot of minions onto the field, so that way your Frozen Touches get infused. You're not just reliant on Cosmic Keyboard and Cold Case, but it's still available in the deck. Unchained Gladiator feels like a kind of underrated card if we can make this card sing, but one thing that does kind of make me feel a little bit on edge of running this card is the fact that it really doesn't work that well unless you play your Aqua Archivist. But this deck still has a lot of card draw regardless. You still, oh wait, you actually don't have your Norgan. Never mind, I take that comment back. We don't even have volume up. So this is very important to get value out of your Unchained Gladiator. So don't play all of your elementals until you, you have this card ready to go. Luckily, Flame Geyser will also give you more elementals to get more card draw out of this. So there's a lot of way of being able to milk this card for everything that it's worth. But you also have Ashwin the Guardian as like the main win condition. Who needs Sif when you have Ashwin, right? Well, it turns out they're both good. And it'd be really funny if you give the +2 spell damage to Sif as well, so this card can maybe give you like +9 spell damage depending on the situation. But you still got Norganon. There's no reverb in this deck, but it's not a control deck, so it kind of makes sense. But if you want a deck that's a little bit more aggro leaning, this might be the way to go. And I've seen this deck just, win by just playing Ashwin into spell cards. So there's a lot of potential for this deck, and having Ashwin may be a good, like, not necessarily replacement, but it's a good secondary card in order to set up OTKs in the games where you can't draw your Sif. Next up is Mech Rogue, and honestly, I have not played a lot of this deck myself, but I've seen so many people trying out this deck to the point where I can't take it anymore. I'm going to try this deck out today and see how good it actually is. But I will go ahead and just give this, I'm just going to go ahead and give this opinion that I'm just going to put out as fact. I think that Mimron is definitely one of the best cards that's come out of Titans, but oh my god, if this thing dies, this deck really feels like it's struggling, because I literally had an opponent where I killed their Mimron, actually I sapped their Mimron back to their hand, they played it again, and then I killed it, and then they just straight up, like, they left the game. They quit. They did not continue that game. I got an automatic win because of it, and I feel like it's because this card is really the meat and potatoes that goes into making this deck as good as it is. There are ways of being able to get value out of, like, Lab Constructor, which I definitely did not give enough I guess, respect to, because this card is absolutely bonkers. One thing that you can just easily do, which actually isn't available in this deck, but if you end up forging it, and then you play, a 3-mana mech like the Spider, or if you play, the Taunt, for example, like the Bronze Gatekeeper, if you immediately magnetize this card going into the next turn, your opponent needs to have an answer. Otherwise, they will die. So there's a lot of these situations with this Rogue deck where it's like extremely good or extremely bad. It doesn't really feel like there's an in-between, and there might be a way of being able to build this deck that milks more of the value out of the cards that just are insanely good, like the Lab Constructor and the Mimron. But other than that, this is just regular Miracle Rogue with, like, without the location, which maybe we want to put the location in. I'm not 100% sure yet. I played a location version during the Theorycraft stream, and it seemed like the way to go, in my opinion. But I'm very not experienced with Rogue, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But regardless, there are a lot of ways of being able to scam games with, a bunch of these mech cards from the scrap heap, giving you insane consistency off of the Spark Bots to maybe get Wind Fury. Wind Fury just scares the ever-living hell out of me in mechs, because this deck can kill you by turn 5 if you let it. So keep in mind, Mech Rogue doesn't really feel like bait right now. We just don't know the best 30-card version of the deck. But if there's a way that this deck can survive that isn't just Mimron and Lab Constructor, then this deck has a lot of promise for it. And I'm still not sold on the Voltron right now. I think I'm going to play a deck that I'm actually showing you next that is Mech Rogue, but it doesn't run the Voltron card. In an effort to give you guys as many deck lists as possible, I realize this this video says top 5 decks, but I'm going to give you 15 decks, because that's just the kind of content creator I am. I don't just go, twice as hard. I go 3 times as hard. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel if you like all of these resources that I'm giving you. Regardless, here's another Mech Rogue. This is probably a better way of being able to build it that goes all in on the mechs and focusing less on the concoctions. And honestly, I was in Ridiculous Hatch stream the other day, and Celestalon is currently saying that their favorite deck to play right now is a Mech Rogue, and they are actually heavily considering cutting out the concoction cards. What? What? You're telling me that Mech Rogue is that good to where the best mechanic in the class right now is actually not being utilized? I would love to see a deck like that, but this is about the closest that I could find. And honestly, I watched Reqvam play this deck like once. He lost immediately after playing his Lab Constructor. He got star powered by a Hunter. and then he just immediately deleted the deck, which is kind of cementing my my hypothesis of this deck is either going to be insanely powerful or it's going to be countered by a lot of the meta, especially with like silence and like heavy removal, to where these cards that seem really, really good, they need to get their high roll like as many times as possible, otherwise you will really, really struggle. But something else that I saw yesterday in McBanter's stream is it was a Mech Rogue mirror, and there was a lot of back and forths where, like, you know, I play big Mech, I destroy it with Potion Melt, Destruction cards, and then suddenly, like, you play a Spider with a Lab Constructor, and then it just makes another, you know, Spider that's stealth, so you can't even interact with it, so then you make another big Magnetize onto it, and then you make another very large Spider. But this card got really disrespected during people's review of the new cards, and I just gotta say that there's a lot of potential for Spider, actually, even though it doesn't have stealth permanently, but it would be kind of busted if that was the case, right? Because then you could just keep building up a big Mech, then you could slap Ziliax on it, and then making a copy of that Ziliax Magnetize card. Oh boy, that is going to be absolutely busted if this thing had permanent stealth. So kind of thinking ahead a little bit here. But yeah, Mech Rogue feels like it has a lot of potential of being like one of the best decks in the game, but it also has the potential of being one of the worst decks of the game. So it's really hard for me to evaluate this deck until I'm actually behind the wheel for myself. But if you want to play some Mech decks, I at least gave you 2 different ideas. Before you get mad, before anyone gets mad, this is not Control Priest. This is Astral Automaton Priest, and that's the only reason why I'm suggesting this deck is because this card is actually a lot of fun. This card is an insane amount of fun, but I really question how good this card and how good this deck's gonna be when the Control Priest deck is perfectly optimized and when we figure out what the best decks in the game are. But if you want a really good fun deck, and I felt like I just had to put this on here because I love the flavor of this card, because the reason why I don't want to just call this Pogo Priest is because this card is way better than Pogo Hopper ever was. You play your first Pogo Hopper, it's a 1-1. You play your second Pogo Hopper, it's a 3-3. No. With this card, you play both Automatons, and both Automatons are 2/2s. They don't just stagnate, they buff each other up, which can create a lot of insane board situations to where, like, I literally got beat by this deck on my grind yesterday because they ended up having, like, the absolute nuts of playing this card on turn 1. Then they had Coin, and so they had played Power Chord Synchronize into Coin out another one. I killed it. They played Animate Dead, and then I think they played Creation Protocol in the middle of this. Like, I don't remember exactly how the game went, but I died by, like, turn 5, turn 6. So, like, there is a way that this deck can absolutely high roll somebody if you don't know what you're expecting. Because suddenly these 1-1s can turn into, like, 6-6s and then 7-7s. And then you also have a Ziliax as well as any Storm Coil, which does summon another copy, so it'll buff all the other ones that are on the field. So there's a lot of potential for this deck, and this was probably one of the only Priest decks that I was going to be able to enjoy. So hopefully, you know, if you guys don't like Control Priest like I do as well, then maybe this deck can make you, you know, look past the fact that it is a Priest deck, but it is a pretty good, fun meme deck that I definitely had to recommend and put on this list. So if you're someone that doesn't like Control Priest, this is about the closest that you're going to get to a Clark HELLSCREAM recommendation of an actual Priest deck. And the last archetype that I'm going to show you, but I have 4 different deck codes to show you guys, is Plague Death Knight. I saw so many people saying this deck was garbage, this deck is the best, this deck is actually the most broken deck in the game. I saw so many varying opinions on this archetype, and one thing that I definitely have to point out is that I don't think anybody knows what the perfect list is yet. That's why I literally have 4 different decks that I'm going to be showing you, which are very similar to this idea here, where instead of going all-in aggression, we're actually going more mid-range, damn near control in some aspects, so that way we give our opponent as many turns as possible in order to draw all of the Plague cards. But just so you guys understand how this archetype works, it is 100% dependent on Hell Yeah. If you do not have a Hell Yeah, then you can't play this deck, because this is the reason why the deck can even kill anybody, because yes, there are, you know, all these plagues that can deal damage, but if you don't have them permanently shuffling back into the deck, it is really hard to deal OTK levels of damage with this deck. But there's also just the consistency of your opponent's going to always have cards that they can maybe draw that aren't plague cards. And honestly, one thing that really drove me crazy playing this deck against like the super greedy control decks is that they would always keep themselves at 10 cards, which really isn't as hard as you think. Mage has infinitized the Maxitude, and Warlock has a lot of card draw tools, and Priest is well Priest and always plays value cards which fill up their hand. So I decided to put in a Dirty Rat in the deck, but this is probably not a good idea in all honesty. Every other deck that I've seen has been focusing a lot more on building up a board and sustaining yourself to where your opponent has to play cards. So that's kind of the big difference there. If you're in a situation to where your opponent is keeping 10 cards and they don't care what they mill, even if it's their own card, then your deck isn't doing a lot to actually threaten them, so you need other ways of being able to deal damage onto the board with cards like, you know, the Chain Guardian, that's like really massive. I've even seen some people just full-on run the Scourge, which I'm not recommending, but I have seen people do it. So there's a lot of experimentation that's going on with this archetype right now. And case in point, McBanterface is another person that I saw playing this deck a lot yesterday, and this is pretty much the deck that I was playing yesterday, but I felt like it was super weak, and that's why I decided to put in the Dirty Rats, because I was like, I feel like this deck needs something else. But I think I just wasn't playing this deck very well. And the main reason why I'm going to hypothesize a lot of people are having success with this deck is because you guys are focusing way too much on shuffling plagues rather than building up tempo, if you know what I mean. Like, yeah, you want to be able to play these cards and shuffle cards into the deck as quickly as possible, but if you haven't played Hell Yeah as quickly as you can, then there are going to be some situations to where maybe you don't want to play the play cards. I'm not saying that it's wrong, I'm just saying there might be a better play and a better line to where some people just, you know, play the Staff of Primus and swing the card every single time. Maybe you need to hold on to this card in order to deal with like a 4/4 in combination with Down the Ship or something. Like, don't just blindly swing every single turn. Think about what you're setting up for. There are going to be situations where it is just right to swing it as quickly as possible, but you need to think about your outs as well as you can, because this deck goes from feeling really good to suddenly crashing down very, very quickly. But this is probably the most common version of the deck that I saw. But cards like Thessarian, I'm not really 100% sold on. Cards like School Teacher definitely feel good in the deck, but I feel like there's just something that players aren't thinking about whenever it comes to, you know, actually making this archetype good. And there's a lot of different ideas that I saw floating around on Twitter. Ike has even gone so far to run an Ignis the Eternal Flame in order to give us a lot more value and a lot more potential off of running a weapon that maybe can give us more health, can draw us more cards, and just overall give us more tempo. The only thing that I don't particularly like about this card, though, is that the only Forge card that we even have is, yeah, Watcher of Sun. Like, I knew that I was missing something, but like, yeah, this card kind of makes sense to give you a little bit of healing. It is one Forge card, but one Forge card for Ignis maybe is a little bit of a red flag. I like the look of this deck overall because you do have, you know, Defrost as a way of drawing cards. There are some people, like, literally every single deck that I've shown you so far doesn't even have the Frozen Over card. And it's mostly for the reason that I was saying earlier, that if your opponent already has, like, you know, 8 to 9 cards, then this card really isn't going to help you in starting that Plague Chain, which is really what you want to do with this deck. So maybe Frozen Over isn't good in this deck. Maybe it is. I'm not sure yet. I need to play more games with this deck before I actually come up with an opinion. But Ike is saying that you can run Ignis, you can run the Defrost for card draw, you could still get away with running like the Thessarian and the Hollow Hound, and obviously Primus is the absolute nuts. This card is going into every single Death Knight deck, regardless of what it is. But there's a lot of, you know, people coming up with different ideas for Plague Death Knight. And this last deck that I'm going to show you has someone actually running Frozen Over, as well as the Necrotic Mortician, which, if you want my honest opinion, I feel like Mortician is just in here to find a Scourge. It just kind of makes sense to find Scourge as, like, you know, a way to threaten onto the board and your opponent has to deal with it. I might actually enjoy just hard running it, but if you're running cards like Distressed, if you're running cards like the Mortician, like the Nerubian Vizier, I already discovered the Scourge once out of playing this deck, so it just makes a lot of sense that an archetype like this can thrive. We just need to figure out the best 30-card version. And as of right now, people seem to have, like, the same idea on, like, a solid 25 cards, but cards like Blightfang, Mortician, Frozen Over, and I guess Runeforging and Bonebreaker to a degree, there's like those last 5 to 7 cards that some people just haven't agreed on yet. So maybe we'll figure out the best way to play this archetype. I'm probably going to be playing this a lot on my grind to rank 1 Legend later today. I probably am not going to hit single-digit Legend, but I still like the idea of going for it. But regardless, Plague Death Knight has a lot of different, you know, capabilities that you can take it with, but as of right now, people seem to think the mid-range version is the best way to play it, and aggro version of Plague Death Knight is unfortunately just a bit too bad and a bit too easily countered, where you just have to play this version of the deck. And I'm very surprised to see that Hollow Hound got cut here. Hollow Hound does feel like a good way of being able to sustain yourself, to give you those extra few turns, so that way they can draw all the plagues. But I'm just going to say this right here, right now. I have played about 10 to 15 games with this deck, not only through the Theorycraft stream, but also through my games with it yesterday. I have not killed anyone with plagues yet. Has anyone actually killed someone with plagues yet? I've only seen McBanter do this once. Like, I don't know, dude. This deck feels like it's always one plague away from lethal, which just happened to be like 2 or 3 times, but I've never actually gotten the kill, so I just had to complain about that real quick. But there you guys have it. Those are the decks that I would recommend. I gave you 15 decks instead of 5 because that's just the kind of content creator that I am. So if you like this kind of content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel to be notified about any of our future updates. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, and we'll see you for the next one.